I really had three challenges, other than starting the presentation, which the first is to make this interesting late in the day, on the second day of the conference. The second was really to fit the real raison d'etre of this gathering, a fantastic conference from my point of view. And the third is to make it fit with really what I've been doing in the last year so that I increase the probability of saying something you haven't already heard. And if you notice, there's the logo up there of the new climate economy. I've spent the last year coordinating the land use part of the new climate economy report that was launched in September. This was commissioned by 7 countries, Norway, UK, Colombia, Brazil, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Korea. And they asked the Secretary General of the UN to convene this commission, which is composed of ex-heads of state, CEOs, and so forth, people who have an interest in sort of what climate change is going to do. And the purpose of the report was really to make the point that growth and climate mitigation are not incompatible. And it did a pretty good job of this. It got 1,400 stories in the international media when it was launched in September. And so I'm going to use some of my time to tell you about the land use side of that story. The first question, given the topic I was given, would really be, why would anyone support international agriculture? And I've been involved with mixed success for a long time, like some of the others here, in trying to get at least my own part of international agriculture supported. And really, there was, for a long time, really up until 2008, 2007, 2008, there really wasn't a lot of interest. When I started in the 70s, there was a huge amount of interest in international agriculture, both in this country and in most other places. And the World Bank, I think, had used its flagship report, the World Development Report, to talk about this. If I remember correctly, maybe Mark Svensson remembers, but I think it was in 1982 or 83. And then there was nothing until 2008. And that's a picture of it there. And I think it did a terrific job of really going into some reasons why you need to support international agriculture: improving food security, reducing poverty, growth, and promoting structural transformation. This was all pretty much agreed to in the 70s and completely forgotten in the 80s and 90s, pretty much. But even so, on its own, it didn't really have that much impact at the time. I mean, it did have impact at the time, but not because of the report, because of something else. And now we also have other issues for agriculture, as in this conference: increasing resilience of livelihoods and mitigating climate change. So really, if you have kind of a premise that if you want to really support agriculture, whether it's international or not, you have to really be able to speak to the people who matter outside the ag sector. I mean, the ag sector is always more or less in favor of increasing support for itself. The question is, what do ministers of finance think? What do heads of state think? And that really leads to two maintained hypotheses: that you either need concern over a global food crisis, as in spiking commodity prices, or you need to communicate really to these people, these ministers of finance and others, that agriculture gives you pathways to get to big questions that they're interested in within a reasonable time frame, and where there's not a quicker solution or a cheaper solution or a more certain solution going somewhere else. So really, if you look at a little history, this on your right-hand side there, that's official development assistance in constant dollar terms. This is a graph out of the World Development Report 2008. And the green one is actually the share of the percentage of agriculture in ODA, and the other is the dollar amount. And really what you see is that before 74, 75, Aid to agriculture was a fairly minor thing, and there weren't too many actors. Basically, there was the World Bank, there was USAID, and in fact, it was really USAID and the World Bank. It was mostly in Asia, and the aid business in agriculture wasn't very big. There was this tremendous explosion after the world got really worried by spiking food prices in 1973-74. And, you know, that's when the UN really grew up in agriculture. IFAD was created, FAO was doubled in size. ODA was vastly increased to agriculture. At the World Bank in 1980, agriculture was 30% of annual lending, for example. And basically it worked. I mean, the supply response was there. It worked. I mean, the Green Revolution came about. It saved a lot of lives. I mean, it was underway already, but that really helped extend it and promote it. You had the CGIR that grew up and so forth. And in 2008, there was that, I should say, there was that long period of complacency that was synonymous with declining real food prices on a secular trend after the late 70s. 2008, it came back. I know in the World Bank, I remember getting lambasted because some government said, well, you know, you really said trust the market. And we resisted for a long time, and we did it. And now look at us. I mean, we got screwed in 2008. Food prices doubled in a few months. You know, 2008 was a lot less severe than the 70s by almost any criterion. But it was still bad, and mostly was unanticipated. And it had certain elements that you had food, fuel as well involved. Certainly there was a response in the world, and in the World Bank, for example. In 2000, in the World Bank, I think if I remember correctly, ag lending was actually 4% of total lending. And the three-year average was 7%. The three-year average by 2010-12 was already 12%. So it was coming back up, and you saw that in bilateral aid programs too. You had much more attention to the market, the creation of the Agricultural Market Information System, a multi-country platform at FAO, transparency in markets. More direct, certainly a lot more direct investment, which was a manifestation of distrust of markets, but many of the BRICS put a lot of money into developing countries, mostly to bypass the market, directly use someone else's land. I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm just saying it's a response. Yet almost all the production response, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm willing to be corrected if I am, but I think most of the response really was in the developed world, the supply response, or in some of the more developed emerging countries. There wasn't a lot of supply growth in the very poor countries. And the world has changed since 1974. In that year, in 74, sovereign debt of the G7, the countries that really mattered at the time economically, was 40% of GDP. It's now about 100%. That's why the aid programs are a thing of the past, unfortunately. I mean, they're not going to grow anyway. What happened really in 2008 was really private-led. I showed you that the World Bank lending greatly expanded, but almost all of that was IFC, the private sector wing of the World Bank. And that was lending to private companies and was primarily in Latin America and Asia, not in Africa. The relative importance of agriculture to growth in developing countries, I mean, just structurally, is a lot less because as countries have grown, the relative share of agriculture has gone down. That means the constituency has gone down too, and the stakes for overall economic growth, except in the poorer countries. And now global food supplies seem to be coming back up. Prices are down about 12% over the last year. And although there have been significant funding gains in publicly funded international research systems, say, I would not be terribly surprised if those start going down again. Unfortunately, the World Bank has already announced that it's going to decrease its support for the CGIR. I'm very sorry to hear that personally. And there's also a lot of other things that are important out there to food security besides agricultural production. Up till now, we've been talking about ag production. And, you know, there are a lot of things that never got fixed even when production was going up. So there's a tension, and that kind of diffuses effort. And now people are beginning to realize what huge uncertainties, I think is the way to phrase it, there are in climate change for things like agriculture and food security. So looking forward, I think you can conclude that if you really want to address, so let me just pause for a second. We had two food crises. They both provoked a spike in support, both in research and investment for agriculture, although the second one was much more private-led than the first one. They're probably short of having another food price crisis, which we will have eventually. Really increasing international support of international agriculture will really depend on delivering the things that the non-ag people are most worried about. And to understand what to do then, you have to look forward and see that agriculture's role is going to be determined by supply and demand as before. But there are also demand and supply for competing users of natural resources, crops, forests, cities. And you've got to realize that a lot of the expansion of agriculture that happened really not just since '74, but really since 1950, has been land expansion as well as yield expansion. There's been significant land expansion as well as yield growth. And land use, you know, we're running out of natural resources, both land and water. Water, I think most people know, the water constraints in many countries. On land, if you look at FAO's SOLAR classification of land, there's supposedly 30% of other land that's available, mostly in Africa, but most of that's either desert or savanna land that is really of questionable actual sustainable value for agriculture. There isn't, you know, we're really beginning to, the carbon budget of resource constraints is beginning to hit. The reality is that someone was mentioning mining natural capital. I mean, you've got, according to FAO, and this is older results that were published in 2010, 25% of all agricultural land in the world is severely degraded to the point that it can barely produce ecosystem services. Another 8% is moderately degraded. And, you know, there are guesstimates that the amount grows by about 50 million hectares a year, though I don't think that anyone really has any way of measuring that or really knows it. It is growing, we don't know how much. But some fairly careful estimates for 7 countries have put the cost in terms of reduced ag production, depending on the country, of 3 to 7% per annum, of the total annual amount, which is far more than the costs of remediation. Agricultural resilience to climate change is the great underfunded issue. And to really get support for agriculture, I think that the powers that be have to understand how important this is to overall national resilience and development. Poor countries certainly understand the importance of resilience, but I know of World Bank missions when I was still there that got thrown out, literally PNG'd, out of African countries for saying to the Minister of Agriculture, we're here to talk about mitigation. He said, with our agriculture, get the hell out of here. You know, you're going to fix your problems with, diminishing, back of the mind, diminishing our agricultural productivity. And so countries know the need for more resilience, but they're not convinced that resilience and mitigation go together, or that productivity and resilience go together for that matter. UNDP estimates that African financing needs for adaptation, and adaptation is the great topic really of our conference, I think. I'll try to make that case more. But African needs are 35 to 50 billion. Total adaptation financing, according to material put together by ODI recently, shows that in Africa in 2012 was 1.6 billion. You see there's a disconnect there. And that must be because we're not making a very good case. Forests, it's not just ag. Remember, it's all land use. You can't really understand the ag problem without understanding the land use problem. Forests are being cut down. FAO says 13 million hectares a year. Matt Hansen would say that gross removal of the University of Maryland would say the gross removal of tree cover from remote sensing would be about 20 million hectares a year. Those two are not necessarily incompatible, but anyway, it's a lot. And net deforestation, that is land that is converted from being used for forests to something being converted to primarily to agriculture or something else, is at least 5 million hectares a year. Now, we act as if the only thing that's growing in demand is food. I mean, WRI, we'd estimate by 2050 the calorie demand will go up 70%. I mean, the conventional cereals volume increase to 2050 from FAO is 50% from 2005. But if you go to World Wildlife Fund and you look at their projections, which I'll come back, well, I'll just tell you that they project that wood pulp demand in developing countries is going to grow 300%, 6 times as much in volume terms than cereals. Why? If you buy something from China, does it just arrive by drone? No, it's in a package. You know, the world's manufacturing center is over there, and that's where a demand for packaging, not to mention newspapers, not to mention growth in bureaucracies and all that stuff. So even though wood and paper demand is going down in the OECD, it is growing exponentially in the BRICS. And this is one of the things that we just don't talk about. Only 7% of the world's forests are under any kind of sustainable management. So, you know, that's where a lot of deforestation comes, because if you can cut stuff down on public land and get away with it, what's to stop you? Agriculture is typically blamed. I'm going to come back to this from the same authors in a minute, but the agriculture commercial is the orange, and you see the tall center column is Latin America. This is by region. And agriculture subsistence also accounts for it. But you know, if you talk to forest people, and particularly in my outfit, like most forest outfits in Washington at least, people have experience in Latin America, particularly in Central America or Brazil, they'll say deforestation is agriculture. I mean, there's really no debate about that. And in fact, if deforestation is understood as land use change, like it was forests and it became something else, what it became was agriculture. We'll come back to what actually motivated it in a minute. One of the problems of increasing support for ag is that in the world, in the time of climate change, ag is the perp. It's second only to energy. Here's a breakdown. It's a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, if you add up components of the circle there, you'll see that livestock accounts for 30%. And that of all this livestock emissions, you've got 80% of that is from ruminants, which means primarily, not exclusively, but primarily cattle. So together, livestock is you know, I'm not a very quick calculator, but that's 7.2 gigatons out of 49.1. That's a large percentage of total emissions. It's just, so it gets in the crosshairs, right? Agriculture as a whole gets in the direct emissions from agriculture are greater than the emissions from land use change, which includes cutting down trees. So support for international agriculture in the absence of food price increases really requires, I'm going to try to make the case that it requires 4 sets of things, because these 4 sets of things will begin to address the things that broader constituencies worried about tight resources, or will soon be worried about tight resources, are worried about. Certainly food productivity research, but it's not sort of a kind of a generalized sort of issue. You know, when we were trying to get support for IFPRI, we always talk about the green revolution. But, you know, it's the low-hanging fruit has been picked. It's the traits. And the traits often have to deal with environmental constraints like drought tolerance, like salt tolerance, and so forth. And I'm not an ag scientist, but I have been told, and I believe, that if you want to be productive in doing this, you must use at least some aspects of biotechnology to really get there. You have to screen a huge amount of material. I mean, sub-1 rice was mentioned. They had to screen at least 10,000 varieties from around the world, accessions, to really get there. And you need to use things like marker-assisted selection. You need to invest in the efficiency. Livestock production in places like Brazil and so forth is very inefficient for the most part, believe it or not. It's surprising, but a lot of it on extensive pastures. You could double productivity of most Brazilian pastures. And the things that you would do to do that would actually reduce emissions per kilo of beef significantly. You get more efficiency, you get less emissions. I mean, what's not to like about that? You just have to focus on it and find some way to reward it, I guess. Deforestation is, you know, if you can get something for free, you know, if you can go down and cut down clear peatlands in Kalimantan, and you know, for free or for a small investment in the government office, you know, what's to stop you? Deforestation, like all land use, is basically a matter of governance. And fortunately, we'll see that that a number of countries understand the importance to their own interests of preserving natural capital. We'll come back to that. And finally, probably the really big agricultural issue, certainly for the next 10 to 20 years, is restoring agriculture and forest landscapes for resilience. It's the sorts of things that Sarah was talking about, and I'll come back to that. I'm not going to stay on this slide very long. I made the point, basically, that you have to, there's actually an error in this slide. It says 2%. It's not. It's more like 7%. That the game has changed a bit in the kinds of ag we need. Here's something I promised the livestock guys, of which I like to count myself one, that I'd have one. This was put together by FAO, and it's kind of fun. That's the kilos of CO2 equivalent gases emitted per kilo of beef production on average in different continents. I mean, you can believe this data as much as you want, but I mean, I think there's got to be something to this. And it has to do really both with the productivity of the systems and with the kinds of things the animals are eating, whether it's just pure cellulose or whether they're getting, you know, better quality feeds. There's a lot of scope for actually increasing efficiency and decreasing production just by transferring better practices. Now, this is actually from the same study I showed you before, the same authors. Now the question is not what drove the conversion of land from being administered by the Forest Department to being administered by the Agriculture Department, which is the FAO definition of deforestation. But this is what actually drove the cutting down of the trees in the first place. And you notice livestock, which was the main forest agriculture interface, is not a major driver there, even in Latin America. It's that there's a huge amount of demand for trees. And if you go to Colombia today, you may find efforts to decrease deforestation in the Amazon, but you also see a huge amount of stuff being shipped out of the Pacific going to China. And my point is simply that if we really want to deal with the kinds of issues involved in land use and greenhouse gas emissions, we have to get into sustainable management of forests, because that wood demand is going to be there, and you have to deal with it. Now, believe me, I don't get any, even in my own institute, people don't like me saying that. But you know, I don't see any way around it. It is a major issue, and environmental people have to get involved in a realistic view of what's happening to wood demand. Stopping deforestation, as I said, is primarily a matter of governance. And there's still plenty of deforestation going on. dealing with food problems are not uniquely a production problem, has been clearly demonstrated, but without it's a necessary, if not a sufficient condition. We really have to, to stop the conversion of forest land to ag land just to get enough food to feed the world would require about 1/3 higher rate of technical progress in terms of kilos per hectare than we had really for the last 40 or 50 years in order to get that 70% more calories by 2050. And we're having trouble even maintaining what we had before, much less increasing the rate of intensification. So intensification is definitely something that's going to happen. When you intensify, let's say you go into Brazil and you intensify pastures, wherever they are, but especially if they're near forest area, as in Brazil are likely to be, then you have to increase forest protection too, because you've just increased the incentive to do agriculture, which is good. But you don't want people to expand onto protected public land and just cut down the natural capital. Now, the big change in the world is that we now have ways to actually make this relatively easy to do. And we see this in the private sector, certainly sees it in its supply chains because they're worried about market friction. Brazil kind of showed the way since 2004. Basically, the Brazilians decided that they were going to stop deforestation in the Amazon because that was part of the political makeup of the country at that time. And they put together a system using MODIS and Landsat images, which they have a building, I think it's actually in Sao Paulo, I'm not sure about that though, where they have 150 analysts that get these photos, and I guess this MODIS goes over every 16 days, but at least monthly they go through this, and the resolution that they use is 25 hectares, and that really allows them to at that level of resolution, they can catch any new deforestation. And stopping deforestation is basically a matter of being timely and having the political will. And you see the curve here. That's the amount of deforestation from 25 hectare or larger chunks in Brazil. And once the enforcement started, it went way down in the legal Amazon. Now, of course, there is a shift to smaller areas, but then the system is now shifting to 6.25 meters. And thanks to, I might add a little plug for my own institute, thanks to Google Earth in collaborating with my institute, there's something called Global Forest Watch, which anyone can find going to globalforestwatch.org, which now does this through software. You don't have to have 150 analysts. And you can sign up for alerts for anywhere in the world. And right now it's 25 hectares and it's monthly, but soon it'll be 6.25 hectares, and every 16 days you can get an alert. And that means that companies can now check up on their suppliers, and NGOs can check up on companies. And it's interesting that Wilmar, which controls 40% of the world's palm oil, has now publicly committed to not source from illegally logged land. Unilever's on board. There are many of the large international supply chains that are now willing to make commitments not to source from illegally logged areas because they can actually check it themselves as well as others checking. The other topic is restoring degraded agricultural landscapes. And there are basically two approaches there. There's the project approach and there's the labor-intensive farmer-managed rehabilitation, which is. Now, the problem with projects is they're very slow. I used to be involved with projects at the bank, and it takes forever to disperse anything. They work, they're a capital-intensive, skills-intensive approach, but you only get so much. The labor-intensive farmer-managed rehab is much slower in the implementation, but you can reach much larger areas. And I'm probably being a bit long here, but I want to tell you a little bit about projects and a little bit about alternative approaches. This is a project from China, a famous project, the Loess Plateau. I'm watching a smile at this. She's probably heard it about 10,000 times because my former boss, her boss, was actually the young TTL who started this. And this was an area that had rich soil, but was completely degraded through millennia of overcultivation. And it started as a watershed rehabilitation project because it was silting up the Yellow River. And certainly goats were part of the problem. They were free-ranging and then cultivating on steep slopes and severe erosion, big dust storms in Beijing, and so forth. This project went in basically to stabilize the land, to keep the silt out of the river and to keep the dust out of the air. And lo and behold, look what you got. And interestingly, livestock was only in there as the first thing they did is get rid of the goats. They had to be confined and then eventually phased out. But the farmers were upset because they got money from livestock, so they put in Kashmiri sheep and they put in dairy. And it turned out that the main return to the farmers, not the ecosystem services directly, but the main return to the farmers was these confined dairy cattle and confined Kashmiri sheep, which were now possible because of the biomass on the land. So what was in it for the farmers and what got compliance from the farm groups was the livestock side, which was an afterthought, but became the biggest part of the project and the highest return. Now, 27% economic rate of returns for livestock is not bad at all. In Central America, again, silvopastoral systems are typically done through projects. They require a huge amount of capital investment, a lot of skilled input, and so forth. The real return to the farmer, in this case, was the livestock. Really, the issue is how do you, the ecosystem services are of value to everybody, but how do you get enough of a chunk of that to the farmer so that they actually cooperate? Because if they don't cooperate, it isn't going to happen. Here's an example of the non-project side, which is in Niger. I used to hang around this part of the world, and it looked like the upper photo. I never, ever thought I'd see anything like the lower photo in that area. And this was basically because of a change in the ownership of trees. And I can go into it in the question and answers time if you want, but this is 5 million hectares. It's not a small amount of land. It did take 30 years, but it took just about $20 of external input per hectare to get that, which for projects would be nothing. I mean, it's absolutely nothing. So the other thing, and in New York, if you followed the communiques in New York, there was the New York Declaration was to restore 350 million hectares of forest landscape, which is very ambitious. That's a lot of landscape. I mean, that's if I'm not mistaken, that's about the size of India or bigger. I'm not sure. Anyway, it's a lot. And to get that, you're not going to just go and, remember the whole problem is a resource constraint. There's an opportunity cost to anything you do. So that's sort of my job at WRI, is to remind the foresters of opportunity cost. It's not a forestry concept, really. And that to do this, it's going to be mostly mosaic restoration, that is on the upper slopes within agricultural areas, which actually restores the ecosystem values. The problem with smallholders, if they're very large farms, as in Costa Rica, the upper and the lower part of the slope belong to the same guy. It's really an easy argument to make. In smallholder areas, they're different people, so you need an institution that redistributes the values. I get the message on hurrying up, but this is the problem, that it is governance. And everything Sarah said is absolutely spot on, and it's all about governance and how you can. And to get the governance, you have to have enough benefits to the people concerned, and that's the hard part of any ecosystem services. This is sort of a premier slide, not from my part of the new climate economy, but from the main summary part. And it's a nice McKinsey waterfall chart. And those numbers there on the waterfall are gigatons of mitigation in CO2e. And you see that land use is really the big boy on the block. And this message was immensely surprising to ministers of finance. I mean, you know, basically, even the energy guys, they practically rebelled when they saw this, and I had to go through all the calculations and convince them. Because, you know, they all say it's coal, it's coal, it's coal. But in fact, in terms of what's actually feasible and can be done, it's land use, land use, land use. And land use can provide 30%, I mean, can provide with growth and productivity if you do it right. And it involves land use planning. I know it sounds terribly lefty, but it's a fact. 30% of the mitigation needed for a 2-degree path. And I'm not going to read these, but those are the calculations. The details are here. If you just Google new climate economy, it's a little hard to get to the actual full report, but it's there, or you can send me an email. Thank you.